Hey everybody, Cybertow back with you again. First off, a quick apology. It's been about a week and a half since I've uploaded. Me and my entire family came down with COVID. Luckily, we were all vaccinated, so all of our cases were completely mild. Just an absurd level of fatigue. I mostly just sat around on the couch staring at the wall and recuperating for the past week and a half, but fully recovered. Both the children are fine as well, so no worries there. So we're back on the chess grind. We're rounding up where we left off. We had just finished reviewing how to fight with hanging pawns. We're going to start a review of how to fight against hanging pawns. I wanted to take this opportunity to look at sort of a one-off that doesn't really fit neatly into any of the categories we went over previously. There's going to be times where you don't hit all the thematic keystones and you sort of have to put your defensive hat on. And this is such a game. This is a legendary duel between two all-time greats. This is Paul Keres against Vasily Smyslov. This was their game in the candidates tournament in Zuerich in 1953. One of the all-time great tournaments, two of the all-time greats battling each other. This is a legendary game that, regardless of whether you play the opening or whether you play any of the structures involved, this is one of those games that you, up to a certain level of strength, you just know. This is something you've heard of and looked at before. So this is an important game to have on board, but it does have some important ideas for hanging pawns. So Keres is white here, c4, 6, knight f3. This was pretty normal for the time. White, usually, if he didn't play knight f3, d4 was the move here. The Mechanis didn't come until later. Now, Vladis Mechanis was playing, and this is around the time that he was introducing the Mechanis attack. You really didn't see it catch on and grow popular until later, until the 70s or 80s. It certainly didn't have any theory at this point. This would have been considered terra incognito for virtually all players, even theoretical experts. So, knight f3, this was White's way of avoiding the Nimzo at this point. It's just, if you didn't play d4, you played knight f3 here. Openings weren't as varied back then. c5, this is sort of Black's way of keeping things a little bit more flexible. Of course, d5, this would reach the Queen's Gambit immediately. White can continue to play cat and mouse with e3 to try to omit d4 in some structures, or you can just play d4 and get into a Queen's Gambit immediately. If Black doesn't want to play that, bishop b4 would be sort of a semi-independent approach. This would be certainly a way to keep it within a Nimzo-Indian flavor. Of course, if White plays d4, this just reaches a Nimzo-Indian straight out. If White tries to keep it within a more Englishy oeuvre, both Queen c2 and Queen b3 are seen here. These are all perfectly fine. g3, another normal Englishy move. The move I personally like from this position, that I play as White whenever I get this position. g4, this was an invention of Grandmaster Zviajintsev. Very interesting. You really don't see this move until much later in modern chess, so back in 1953, no one would have even thought to have played this move, much less analyzed it. But it makes a certain amount of positional sense. So the threat of g5 is going to fight for the e4 square, and the e4 square is sort of the square that you're fighting for in these Nimzo structures. So it has a sound positional basis. Also, it can just turn into a flat-out kingside attack where positional features really aren't thought of at all. Now, it is weakening. It deprives a White of kingside castling. I mean, there's no way he can castle on the kingside at this point. But it's very interesting. When you look at the results, White scores very, very much above the average from these positions, just because he gets these unbalanced positions that, again, it's easier to attack than defend, and White is certainly on the attacking side of these structures. So, interesting position. If you get this position, give it a try. g4 is sort of emblematic of modern chess, that g4 is considered almost normal now, along with moves like it. But c5 keeps things a little bit more flexible. e3, this is a little bit more passive, but it sort of tries to restrain Black's options. g3 would be sort of a more normal theoretical approach. This would be one of many ways of just reaching a flat-out mainline Tarrasch Queen's Gambit declines. This would, of course, be highly theoretical. White can also play d4 here, but this isn't really convincing. this would be a con Sicilian. I personally play queen c7 here to avoid mainline theory. But bishop e4 is the main line here. White score, this is fine for black. You know, Carlsen played this as white in his first match against Anand when he first won the world title. But objectively, these positions are perfectly fine for black. So e3, in some ways, is a little bit more flexible, just keeping the position in stasis. Bishop e7, trying to keep things flexible. d5 would be one way, and then this would reach that Tarrasch/Queen's Gambit accepted line. And bishop c4. This either bishop c4 or bishop d3. That, as you've seen in some of my other videos, this is sort of a matter of taste. Bishop c4 is the Botvinnik approach, just immediately putting pressure on the d5 outpost. That would be my choice, but bishop d3 is perfectly fine. But either of these moves, this would be a standard isolated queen-pawn structure that you can reach from a million different openings. Subjectively, I prefer white, but this is just a good balanced fight. Bishop e7, it tries to keep things a little bit more flexible in terms of structure. b3, d4 is more direct, and it would be my approach as white. d5, and again, the same matter of taste. Bishop c4 would be my choice, the Botvinnik approach, but bishop d3 is also a standard. Knight c6, castle, rook e1, and this is a standard Queen's Gambit declines / isolated queen pawn position you can reach from 20 different openings. Just a good balanced fight. I personally prefer white subjectively, but that's just a personal preference. b3, it tries to allegedly keep things a little bit more flexible, but it's also very committing in that white knows he's putting his bishop on b2, so that sort of takes away some of his flexibility in terms of piece arrangements. And we'll look at that a little bit later. Castle, b6, d5. This would be a modern approach that you really wouldn't see back in 1953. a3, very much a modern move that you wouldn't see nowadays. The a-pawn restrains both the knights from hopping into b4. Then h4. This is an approach of Karyakin used in a game against Anand. I believe this is 2018, if I remember right. This is a Karyakin-Anand game where Karyakin won a very nice textbook win. But h4 is a very modern move. The knight's going to hop to g5 to pressure the h7 point. That's it. And creating those weaknesses on the king's side is going to help white try to find a target for his pieces. And notice how not playing d4 has aided white's flexibility. This bishop on b2 is still incredibly strong, solely because we haven't committed to d4 just yet. b6, a little bit more solid, avoiding that early contact in the center. d4, e takes. I would personally prefer queen x d4. I think this is still just dead equal. I mean, this is a hedgehog where white hasn't even achieved d4, so this can't be worse for black. But the problem with this position, and this can start our hanging pawn discussion. So Smyslov plays d5 here, which is completely correct. A lot of times the tensions between hanging pawns and isolated queen pawns, some of the gains for the hanging pawn structure is that the defending side isn't sure which structure you're going to be going towards, so they can't optimally set up for one structure or the other. So you can use that flexibility for certain gains. Here, it doesn't make any sense at all for white to go for an isolated queen pawn. This bishop on b2 is just horrendous, and this is already a slightly better position for black here. Now, this bishop on b2 just doesn't make sense. This pawn on b3 is just a flat-out weakening. This makes absolutely no sense as an approach to an isolated queen pawn structure. So the fact that white is committed to a hanging pawn structure, and he doesn't have an isolated queen pawn structure as an option, means that white is free, or black is free to optimally set up against a hanging pawn structure. So a lot of white's flexibility has been taken away, and a lot of opportunities for gains have been taken away because he doesn't have that isolated queen pawn option. So d5, excellent choice, just immediately establishes that foothold in the center and just heads straight for optimally setting up against the hanging pawns. Bishop e3, knight c6. Knight c6 is a move that you typically do want to play against the hanging pawns because that knight is often so well placed on a5 to pressure the c pawn. So black's already optimally setting up. Castle. Bishop e7 was played. Black can also take here, I'm showing this line to show the tactical device for defending the d-pawn. So knight x d4, bishop a6 is the best move, and this is still fine for black, just pressuring the c-pawn, but taking d4 is verboten. And that's the tactical device that's defending the d-pawn for white. But Smyslov doesn't fall for it, bishop b7, rook c1, just developing logically. When you look at the players of the greats, this is something I say quite often. When you look at the players of the games of the greats, they just develop their pieces. It's rare to see a game where a Botvinnik or a Tal or a Smyslov, they're playing with half of their pieces asleep. When you look at the games of the greats, so often they just finish their developments, and they don't let half of their pieces stay asleep. So here, Keres is just finishing his mobilization before committing to anything. And black is already pretty much finished with his mobilization, so Smyslov is ready. Knight b4. So black has finished mobilization, so he's ready to try to draw concessions from white's position. Ideally, white would like to retreat this bishop to b1, because that's where that bishop belongs, because it's on that diagonal attacking the king side. Unfortunately here, that simply drops a pawn. And the light-squared bishop is completely vital. For instance, if white plays something like knight e5 that looks superficially aggressive, this is a much better position for black. Black has a bishop pair. This light-squared bishop is an unopposed monster. It's just ruling the long diagonal. And it's often the light-squared bishop that's often the engine for the dynamism for these positions for white. So without the light-squared bishop to generate threats against the king side, white just has the weaknesses of the hanging pawns, and black is just free to load up against those. So white needs to preserve his light-squared bishop by dropping him back to f1, but this is certainly not what this bishop signed up for. This is not an ideal spot for this piece. So already, this is a bit of concession for white. Or from white. Knight d4. This is actually a somewhat serious mistake from black. Rook e8 would be correct. Just, again, finishing mobilization. It's starting a reorganization process that's important to keep in mind when fighting against hanging pawns. 6. Bishop comes back to where it belongs. Knight a5, attacking the c-pawn. Standard for this position. Again, the stronger you get, the less you pay attention to schoolyard Tarasha rhymes. So here, the knight is on the rim, but it's doing a fantastic job. You know, the c-pawn is the target for this position. So black targets it. And the knight on a5 is perfectly posted to attack that c-pawn. Knight e5, aggressively defending. And bishop f8. And this is standard reorganization for this sort of position. So the bishop drops back to f8. And black is going to complete the syllogism with g6. So g6 blocks out this light-squared bishop, blocks out that bishop from attacking black's king side, and then black will fill the fianchetto with bishop g7, which aims at the potentially weak d-pawn for white. This is a very common reorganization for black that you need to keep in your database when facing hanging pawns. This reorganization with rook e8, bishop f8, g6, bishop g7. You also see this from the white side. You see rook e1, bishop f1, g3, bishop g2 when facing hanging pawns on the black side. So something to keep in your mental database. That is a very common reorganization technique. Here would be completely appropriate. This is still a balanced position. Knight e4, it's too aggressive. Now, being aggressive is usually preferable to being too passive. Here, it pays off for Smyslov because Keres immediately commits to something that he should not commit to. So a3, completely correct. This puts black on the precipice, actually. This is improving white's pieces very dangerously. Knight a6 is sadly necessary. It's tough to make a move like this. And this is a very favorable position for white. So this knight on a6 is truly grim. This doesn't have a good way back into the game. Black's just probably going to have to bite the bullet and play knight b8 and then knight c6, and that's most certainly a loss of time. Rook taking the c3 has sort of completed the first part of a rook lift, so this rook could easily get into the game via h3 and lift over to assault the king side. You can easily imagine a move like d5 being effective here, just battering the position open for these bishops on b2 and d3. This is a very promising position for white, but this is still black in the game. Whereas knight c3 actually puts black in the brings somewhat surprisingly. Knight c6, knight e5. This is entirely the wrong idea. To begin with, when you're looking for activity, when you're looking for a kingside attack specifically, trading minor pieces off is almost always a horrible idea. And here, white's choosing to trade off another set of minor pieces at a time when he has those pawn weaknesses, when he has those hanging pawns. When you have an isolated pawn or when you have hanging pawns, you don't want to be trading off pieces, especially minor pieces. Here, white has a surprisingly thematic idea, but it's important to remember this idea. c5. It's important to remember that the hanging pawns can be an asset on themselves. They are mobile, and you should always keep in mind that you can push those pawns. So bxc5 is one way of handling this. But here, the queenside pawns are much more of an asset than the central pawns. White can easily prepare down the road a quick a4 and b5, and then he suddenly has those very strong passed pawns just streaming up the board, gobbling up space. If black tries to preempt b4 with a5, white can simply play it anyways. And if Keres looked at the c5 idea, this is probably what he missed, because this is actually a fairly counterintuitive pawn sacrifice, but it is a temporary pawn sacrifice. If black is pretty much forced to take. I mean, otherwise just b5, c6, and the game is over. Black will be more or less down a piece, in effect. But rook b3, if black takes, black is losing a piece. But if the knight retreats to c6, white has overwhelming activity. This rook on b6 is quite strong. This pass pawn on c5 is genuinely an asset for white. This is on the verge of winning for white anyways. So the c5 idea, it looks paradoxical, but it's actually quite logical, because these hanging pawns are always an asset unto themselves, and you should always be looking at the idea of gaining space with your pawns. But knight e5 is just completely the wrong idea. You don't want to be trading off minor pieces when you have hanging pawns. Rook h5. So this is Keres' idea. So he's going for broke on the king side. For some context, I believe this was either the last round or the next to the last round of the Zuerich tournaments. And Keres had to beat Smyslov to have a chance to be the candidate to play Botvinnik. So Keres was playing all out here. He was playing all out for a win. So often, when you play all out for a win, or you specifically play for a draw, your results are going to be worse than if you just played otherwise normally. The best way to play for a win is to play objectively good chess. The best way to play for a draw is to play objectively the strongest moves and to achieve a draw from a position of strength. So often, you see someone playing for a draw specifically, and then they just play so passively that they end up losing. So often you see someone specifically playing for a win, and then they just play so aggressively that they just get crushed. Just when you need a specific result, just play normally. Play strong chess, play good chess, play objectively good chess, and see what results comes your way. But here, Keres is outright playing for an all-out kingside assault, and here it completely backfires. g6. And it's hard to give this move a question mark, because objectively it's the wrong move, and it's the losing move. But if Keres had played the right move, he would have been stuck defending a passive worst position for 40 moves against one of the greatest technicians of all time. So he probably would have lost anyways. Objectively, the right move is to just retreat the rook calmly. Bishop g7. Taking in c4 isn't that great. And white actually has quite dangerous compensation here. Queen h6 is already a near decisive threat. And white has interesting ideas of discoveries with like rook b3 or rook c2. One example, b3, rook xh5. And this already regains the pawn. This is equal, but this is still a dangerous tactic for white. This is exactly the sort of position that Keres would be very happy to achieve from this. But bishop g7 holds things. And then rook c1. White is still holding. So in this context, holding is white has a passive, slightly worse position that he's going to have to defend for the next 40 moves. That's not a great vision. That's not what he had in mind when he went for this. So objectively, rook ch3 is a losing move, but it at least gives Keres some hope to outplay his opponent in a complex struggle. Now, that complex struggle never materializes because Smyslov just easily beats off the attack. But at the very least, he gave himself a chance, whereas playing the right move would have just led to a passive slog. So it's hard to say which approach. It's sort of the do you prefer to die by fire or ice dilemma, counting the fire side of things. But here, Keres goes for broke, and Smyslov gives a virtuoso defensive clinic. So dx c4, just immediately, white is going for broke on the king side, so Smyslov very logically opens up counterplay against the hanging pawns. Don't defend passively. If you defend passively, you're just going to end up being passive. Defend actively. Get counterplay against your opponent's position. Rook takes h7. This is the final error. Queen g4. Thousands of pages of ink have been spilled upon this move, so I thought it was sort of pointless to get into the analytical slog over this move. Braunstein was the first person to point this move out. I think it's still losing for white. c3 is still the best move here. Rook e8. I give a few brief lines here. Like I said, I didn't. This is an examination of hanging pawns, so I thought it was sort of useless to get into the analytical slog when so many computers have already looked at this line, along with so many grandmasters. The most interesting line to me, bishop b5. e5. This seemed very thematic to me because these rooks in the h-file, they're only good for mate. If white achieves checkmate, these rooks have a point. But if white never mates, these rooks are just completely misplaced. So this opening up of the center and opening up of counterplay while these rooks are misplaced on the other side of the board is incredibly thematic. You know, this is quite a bit of material just exiled to the side of the board, doing nothing for white now. The critical line, exd4, and here black's temporarily a rook down. But nearly all of white's pieces are hanging here. All of these pieces are just completely misplaced. White has this weak back rank. This is a losing position for white. Rook e8. And white's just losing. No, black's even material down here. Black's a full exchange down, but this super strong pass d pawn. This rook is coming to the e2. Both of these rooks are still completely marooned on the other side of the board. Completely winning position for black here. So queen g4 was the best way to keep the game going. Rook takes h7. c3. This is a key defensive idea, but here it completely disrupts white's entire attacking mechanism. So the basic tactical idea is if the bishop takes, just rook takes. And the attack is over, black is up piece. So queen c1, the only way to keep the game going. So the idea of queen h6 is coming up. So queen takes d4. Notice how this queen and bishop are both in unison reinforcing the long diagonal and preventing inmate threats. Sort of a beautiful lifeline. Queen h6, creating one cheapo, which black easily dodges. The idea is for rook c5. Rook g7 works as well. That would be the idea, but rook fd8 easily dodges it by creating that hidey hole in f8. Bishop c1, so that's forced finally, but now the bishop drops back. Shooing away white's pieces. The rest is just completely easy. I'll give the rest just for completionism. And the pawn will take on d1 on the next move. This game is over. So, famous game, sort of a fairly easy defensive task from Smyslov. This wasn't nearly as hard a game to play. But sort of a legendary route in that Keres decided to go all out. and very quickly came to regret it. But really, the key to the position was earlier. So here, this is already, in my opinion, somewhat favorable for black. It's objectively balanced, but because white doesn't really have the option of going into an isolated queen pawn, black can just optimally set up for the hanging pawn. So he can put his knight in c6 to come to a5 to pressure that c pawn. And he knows that c pawn is going to be there because that isolated pawn structure really isn't an option for white. So black's able to optimally set up for the hanging pawn structure. Now, black does play this a little bit inaccurately. Rook e8's best here. So this way of playing against a hanging pawn is quite vital. So definitely review this. This bishop f8 reorganization is something you need in your mental database at all times. This is just a classic reorganization play against hanging pawns. Black does misplay this and gets on the brink. Now, when white misses this key idea of c5, again, hanging pawns are mobile. You always want to be looking for opportunities to push those pawns if it's profitable, but once white trades off more of his minor pieces, all the dynamism is completely gone from his position. And here, Keres decides to go for broke. It just doesn't work, because white doesn't have enough material left to attack, and there's just not enough weaknesses in black's position. You know, this queen and the bishop are holding the long diagonal effortlessly. But yeah, really the main theme, this was an optimal position for black out of the opening, so it allowed him to optimally arrange some of his pieces. But really the idea is, when you come under attack against hanging pawns, get counterplay. Immediately go for counterplay. Don't defend passively. If black didn't have this resource of taking on d4, this might be a losing position for black. But because that queen was able to chop on d4 and create that extra counterplay, and reinforce that long diagonal, white's mating threats never came to fruition. And this was just a classic victory from Smyslov. So, very quick game. I just wanted to give that for your mental database because it is a vital game, but also has some important hanging pawn themes. Good to be back on the chess grind. We'll continue review tomorrow. We'll see you then.